Business research methods. It's the second lecture about designing research. It's closely related to the first lecture. So we were speaking about constructivism, relativism, approaching research, different perspectives. Now we go a bit deeper into that. Take an example as first and go into how do you design a qualitative research approach and how do you design a quantitative research approach. That's the topic for today. And I want to go in designing a structured interview because that's actually what most of you do writing a master thesis, working with structured interviews. We will discuss about more quantitative surveys and designing questionnaires next lecture. I'm not talking about that today, but I'm going a bit into designing quantitative research. So let's take an issue, what we all face nowadays. We have crowd movements transporting some topics. We have Fridays for Future, young people fighting for climate, not for climate change, but for mitigating and climate change consequences and for stopping that climate change and environmental pollution. That's one crowd actually protesting, being obvious, being in the press. We have another crowd coming with this COVID-19 pandemic situation, people who do not want to get vaccinated, people who protest against all measures we have to bring down the numbers of infections with this Querdenker movement. So just put yourself in a role of a researcher. You want to not to judge or to say that's good or bad. It's not your task as researchers doing that. Your task is to explain how that crowd movements actually appear. What makes them happen? Why do people do that? Why do people organize in crowds? Protesting, going on the streets and want to have some change. I mean, both groups are going for change. So in the first question you have to ask when designing research, how much do I know about the formation of crowd movements? How much research is done? It's not the first time that we have that. We had a lot of crowd movements throughout centuries, fighting for better working conditions, fighting for political change. We had revolutions, the French Revolution, the October Revolution in Russia. So we had many crowd movements actually changing the world dramatically, but also appearing somehow. But what makes them appearing? Research looks for explanation. So you are actually looking for explanation what makes crowd movements appearing. So when you go in and look whether do we have enough knowledge to explain that? Are there theories that have been proven to be a value in explaining that crowd movements? And when you come up with a solution or as a conclusion of your search, no, we don't have the theories. I don't know enough. We have to go in depth into that to actually explore those crowd movements because we cannot explain with existing theories why that happens. We cannot explain Querdenker, we cannot explain Fridays for Future. When you make this decision, after you have carefully searched for theories, literature, knowledge about it, then you have the conclusion that you do inductive research. That means going in depth in the field to find out what's going on. And that indicates mostly qualitative research methods, in-depth interviews, structured interviews, observations, participation in happenings, in events. So you are close to what you want to research. But what does distinguish that approach? After deciding I don't know about that, I go into that, I try to find out what's going on. I interview people, I observe people. What does it make, what is the difference to journalism? You have to ask yourself this question because journalists do exactly the same. If there is a problem, if there is an issue, they go in, interview people, draw conclusions, write about it. But what does a scientist distinguish from a journalist? A scientist goes in and uses several sources. And there we are by triangulation. Or a scientist does not go in alone. Several scientists go on and gather this information. Or you go in with different measurement instruments. So we have, as scientists, a whole set of methods that we have to use to distinguish science from pure journalism. And we were talking last time about it, that you have various options to do this qualitative research. You can triangulate on persons, so that several researchers doing the same, doing this interview, interpreting this interview, doing the coding. We just come to these interviews in a minute. Or you go in and have different sources of data. You do observe, you do interviews, you go into documentation. So you have different sources and you try to triangulate these different sources. You also can have different theories in explaining what you find. So you have a triangulation on theories. And that approach by triangulation distinguishes you from journalism. So how do you design actually a structured interview guideline? And that's something students always do wrong. I mean, I have hardly seen anything which is right when seeing master thesis by designing a structured interview. An interview and a questionnaire as a general structure is pretty similar. You go in with easy questions about personal characteristics, structural characteristics, gender, age, profession, whatever easy question you like to ask and what's important in this case. And then the next part are the questions you're investigating. And that question have to be formulated according to what you actually derived from knowledge you find. Even if it is not complete knowledge and you don't test theories, you derive it from that what's there. And you really clearly formulate these questions. The difference is, in a questionnaire, you have scales from agree to not agree, or I like or I don't like. So you work with scales. In interviews, you don't work with scales. You have the general question, and you wait until this interviewee is answering this question. And then, of course, you have the option to ask more detailed about what you want to know. So if someone's saying, what profession do you have? And I would say, I'm a professor. So it's not enough information for you, because still it does not answer what I'm doing. So you would maybe ask the question, what does it mean? What do you exactly do? And then I might talk more about it, and you get more information. And so you work in layers, and you prepare structured interviews in layers, so that you, when you did not get a sufficient or satisfying answer, you ask more and more detailed questions. And that can look like that. That you go on the second level and you say, do I understand that correctly? Can you specify that? What's the main point? Can you be more exact? And then this interviewer will tell you more. And if you are still not satisfied, you go to a third layer and you ask, can you repeat it? Can you phrase it differently? You go into that. So you actually, step by step, bring this interviewee so far that you get the information you want to have. And that's actually the guideline of the structured interview. An in-depth interview doesn't work with that. An in-depth interview, an open interview, lets the interviewer actually speak about it as long as possible without actually structuring that in layers. And that's the difference. And then you have a lot of text, of course. You ask and you have a lot of text. You have to transcribe this text. That's in research always done. You can use modern software by recording it with a microphone, and it is translated into text. Of course, you have to go through it. It doesn't work perfectly yet, but it works quite fine, so you don't have to type it in. And then you can actually go on with that. And the next step in interviews is coding. So that you go into the text and you code certain things that are obvious. For instance, when you go into work conditions and you ask about the motivation of work, the interviewer might say, I'm motivated by my colleagues, by this nice working atmosphere. Another would say, I'm motivated by getting a high salary. So you actually could code it as intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. So you have two codes, and all other interviews you could code in the same way. And then you actually, it's a sort of data mining, getting that down to the central codes. And then you can find interrelations to the central codes and interpret what it's in interviews. If you see similarities, if that it's very different, what actually appears out of these interviews. Qualitative research is nothing else than also a kind of data mining. You have long texts, you code this text, and you see interrelations among those codes. Of course, you can use software for that. I will come to that. But a lot of people do it actually by hand. And when you do in a master thesis, I would anyway suggest doing it by software. It goes much easier. But actually in research, several people should do that you end up with the same codes and the same interrelation of codes, because it's a quite subjective kind of thing going into text and coding. Okay, let's say, coming back to the crowd movement, you have gone into that. You made a number of structured interviews with some Querdenkers and some Fridays for Future demonstrants. You have coded that and you have evaluated that. And now you are able, without having really a theory, but maybe you're able to formulate hypotheses and go on with deductive research. But imagine you don't have done this qualitative research. You just have thought, okay, there are so many theories about crowd movements, I don't have to do it in a qualitative way. I immediately actually can do it in a quantitative way. And quantitative means you have structured measurements. You have a survey with scales. You also can quantify qualitative data, observations, interviews, but mostly quantitative researchers go into with questionnaires, with numbers, use existing documents to quantify them, to put them into numbers to do statistical testing. And statistical testing, it's a method where I want to actually calculate mathematically whether what I have found, it's really there in a population. Mostly you work with a sample, you calculate a number, a mean value or whatever in the sample. Let's take this example of COVID-19 infection and vaccinations. It's a good example for statistics. You take the sample that are vaccinated and you take a sample out of people that are not vaccinated and you look how often they get very serious illness, infections. And then you find the difference. And then you test whether the difference you find in the samples can be transported to the population. And that's what mathematics do with likelihood calculations, and that's statistics. And that you actually prove your hypothesis. Your hypothesis, taking the case of COVID-19, would be that you find less serious cases among infected people, among vaccinated people than among non-vaccinated people. And we really find that. Here, it's not that obvious with those crowd movements. It's a more complex story, but still you can come up with some theories and hypotheses that are quite testable. A theory as such, before you can, there are different perspectives on a theory. There are researchers that say everyone has theories when you have a thought. When you have a causal logical thought, it's already a kind of primary tentative theory you have. Others say no, a theory has to be explicitly formulated and it has to be able to be broken down in hypotheses. So there are also different views. If we handle the more strict view, and I like actually the more strict view, the theory really should be possible to break down a theory into hypotheses. That would mean that certain things that are labeled theory as grounded theory, system theory, network theory are no theories. A grounded theory cannot be broken down in hypotheses. A system theory cannot be broken down in hypotheses. You never can test that. Therefore, I would not say that are theories. Other researchers would argue differently. But when you want to go into quantitative research, and mostly qualitative research comes with grounded theory, system theory, network theory. When you really want to go in quantitative research, you have to formulate hypotheses because you're going to test something. And testing means that you formulate, I find that maybe difference in the population. Oh, the difference is there, that would be your hypothesis, and what you actually test is a nil hypothesis, there is no difference. And if you can reject your nil hypothesis, you accept your own hypothesis. That's actually the procedure how statistics and how quantitative research works. So explaining crowd movements. There are many theories that could explain crowd movements. You go to crowds because you want to enforce your own interests. You go to crowds because you're similar to the others. You carry the same ideas, visions, passion. Therefore, you crowd up. You go to crowds because, you're close. You're from the same companies, the same suburb. You go to crowds because you know, logically, to enforce what you actually want to do only works with being grouped up with other people. So there are many theories which allow formulating hypotheses. And that are network theories. Some theories are really usable in this case. Other theories are a bit distant and difficult to apply in this case. When we zoom it down, I think there are three theories that actually are quite handy in this case. I mean, it's a theory of self-interest. When I don't want to get vaccinated and I don't like all the measures that I'm not allowed to enter a restaurant or that I have to go in home office. So to actually make my voice loud, I group up with other people because I have a self-interest that does not happen, that disappears. It's a theory of self-interest. Therefore, you group up with other people. Or you realize that you only can actually enforce something in your advantage or an advantage of a group when you group up and protest as a group. That would be a theory of mutual interest or collective action. Or you group up because people meet with the very same interests. So there are that's called in social science homophilia. When you share the same thoughts or you are from the same neighborhood, you speak the same language. So actually there are similarities which make you grouping up. Or you are some proximities, or you are working in the same, like you are at the same university in the same course. So you have some proximity. It makes you more likely grouping up than others, with others who you don't know. So the last one, this proximity, being very similar in thoughts and opinions and visions, might be true for Fridays for Future. It's more close to them because they all have the vision and want to stop climate change and want to have the economy changing towards a sustainable transition. There is a quite unique opinion among those group members, among this crowd, among this movement. That's not the case with Querdenker. Querdenker is a quite diverse group from some right-wing people, some esoteric people, some whatever crazy people. So, but it's extremely diverse in this group. So maybe the third theory, it's not really applicable to the crowd movements of Querdenker, but it would be applicable to the crowd movements of Fridays for Future. All other aspects, this one or two theory, it's applicable to both. And the theories actually enable you to now formulate hypotheses. Or first come to a conceptual model which displays hypotheses, saying when you want to enforce goals with others, you join a crowd movement. When you seek power with others, you join a crowd movement. And when you share similarities with others, you go to a crowd movement. And that, it's the same as formulating it in this hypothesis. So you have gone from a question to a theory to hypothesis And now you would use a quantitative research design to test exactly this hypothesis. And now also the problem emerged, where it might be easy to do a qualitative research in this case, to go into these movements themselves, go to a demonstration of Querdenker or Fridays for Future and interview people, maybe with structured interviews. Doing a quantitative approach, which has a precondition that you get a representative sample of this movement, now gets the real problem. How do you get this representative sample to actually test your hypothesis? It might be possible to design scales that you actually can measure the self-interest, that you seek power with others in a group, the similarities, that all you can measure. We will find scales for that. But who is actually filling the survey and where do you distribute it to get a representative sample of those movements? That's another very deciding question when you actually design research. For Fridays of Future, we speak about younger people. Where do you approach them? Approaching them at demonstrations is difficult. Approaching them somewhere else at blogs and in the internet, you might get a very biased sample going there. It's the same when you only go to universities or to schools. So you really have to think about how you get a sample. I don't have a real solution here, how to get the best sample, to get it as a representative group. But the design of research actually requires you to carefully think about how do you get a representative sample. The same appears with Querdenker. How do you get a representative sample of Querdenkers? I mean, of course, going to the demonstration is always a solution, but do you get a representative sample of Querdenker by distributing questionnaires at a demonstration? Probably not. At the internet, it's difficult. Where do you find them? There is no list. When I make a survey among students, you are all registered at this university. I have a list of all 35,000 students here. So I can take a random sample out of it and make a research. But we don't have a list of all people demonstrating in Fridays for Future to get a random sample out of it. And we don't have a list of Querdenker. So that makes it extremely difficult sometimes to study that. And that also could be a reason why you rather do a more qualitative research design and you do not test hypotheses, you're just exploring the field because there is no way, no possibility to get a real random sample of this population. That's also in your own research design that should play a role, that it should make sense doing research, not getting one sample. If a sample is biased, the information you draw from the sample and the conclusions can be very wrong. If you go to a more quantitative method, it's the same what I said. You start with easy questions, you start with analytic questions, and when you start research, actually you go into the literature and you take the scales that have been validated in research before. You're not developing your scales your own because you have to test and pre-test them. It's very difficult using just a scale. So when you write a master thesis, or a bachelor thesis, what will be probably the first scientific piece, go into the literature, take out the scales others have used before and validated, rather than doing it yourself. There are also books which are full of scales for different things. In social science, almost everything has been measured in the past, so there is no need to develop your own scales. Use what's there. Of course, there are scientists that develop new scales in measuring new phenomenon, new things, but that's really difficult in establishing new scales in research. And that's when you start as a researcher, not your task. For literature research, and that's where you start out. Doesn't matter what you do, qualitative or quantitative. First, you have to dive in the literature. There are courses here at the library where you can actually learn how to do a systematic literature review. But there are also, let's say, pools of literature that can be used. Google Scholar is a pool, but Google Scholar is extremely broad and does not have any quality control. So if you look for something at Google Scholar, you might have a lot of hits, but there is no indication what's really went through a quality control. A quality control in research means there was a peer-reviewed process, so that I'm not publishing something and nobody was looking at it before. I'm publishing something and other researchers have evaluated that it is publishable, that my research actually fulfills the condition of decent research. And at Google Scholar, that's not done. Still, for explorative research, you might use it. Where it is done is Scopus. Scopus is from Elsevier, and that's a data bank of scientific journals that are evaluated according to the quality control processes. So all articles you find there have gone through a quality control process, and a decent one. It's a quite good control, it's a quite good data pool. You also can download the criteria before a journal comes into the data pool or not. Another thing for business administration research is EBSCO. That's also a controlled data pool, and only journals, articles go in that went through a quality control. Social Science Citation Index also. I mean, TU Library, for books it might make sense. For articles I wouldn't use it. Anyway, books in research have to be considered with caution because many books did not go through a quality control. Then you might look at some proxy at the publisher. If it is a big, famous publisher, the quality control is better. Springer, Elsevier, Klüver, that are publishers that control books. But actually everyone can publish every book without any quality control. So you can write something, go to a publisher and publish your book. And nobody knows if you do not look at it, what's actually the quality of it and if it is valid what you claim and what you say in that book. About software you use for research. Excel, it's usable for statistical research. It's easy to use. I mean, you get it with every Office package. What you get here at the university for some euro, and you can also get it online for some euro. I think it costs you 130 euro for 2 years. It's a lot for a student, I know, but the whole package, having it at full package is much more expensive. It costs thousands of euros, SPSS. Many researchers use startup. That's open. It's not open. It's expensive software, but the sources are open so that researchers actually develop on it and refine it day by day. R is a free software you can download, but it requires some program capabilities to go into that. It's the same as Python. If you have time and interest, I would suggest going for R and Python because you can do many more things with that. In Python, you can do qualitative research, web scraping. You can do a lot of things using that. If you do simple statistics, Excel probably is sufficient, or you buy you for your study, maybe for your master study, SPSS. What is free in a limited version is HLM, that's hierarchical linear modeling. When you have smaller data sets, you can download it for free as student version. And that explores when you have several levels. For instance, I go for the students in Berlin. I have 3 big universities. And to control there may be differences in these universities, I have a second layer in my data. So I sample maybe random students at this university, at Humboldt University and Free University. I put them into one data file. I maybe want to know how happy you are with your study conditions. But then I do a second layer on it, whether there are differences between the 3 universities. And that's hierarchical data. In this way, I have a higher level and a lower level. And for that, I might use hierarchical linear modeling. In questions we ask in social science, you quite often have several layers. And therefore, it's a quite usable software, and it's quite handy to use. The other is UCINet. I will introduce when we speak about social networks. It's also downloadable for free. And it's a very easy to use software also for statistical purposes, but also for network drawing purposes. For qualitative research, the most prominent tool is MaxQData. You find it here at the university at the pool of the sociology department. They have a computer pool where you can use MaxQData. What we use more often is Atlas TI. That's the software from a TU startup. It's also quite prominent worldwide and used, but you can download it for free at our university pages when they work. At the moment, you cannot. And when you want to analyze photos or observations, when you record things, Tableau is a software that's actually quite prominent and usable for using pictures, small films for qualitative research, but also for quantitative research. Okay, taking an example, that's research we have done 2 years ago. We were asking the question, and you all come from different countries, maybe you can capture that. Do people living in countries where climate change is really, you feel it really, like Bangladesh or some islands where the water level are rising, where you have floods, where the weather conditions are changing, does climate change actually bring people to be more entrepreneurial and to start more sustainable entrepreneurship in fighting this climate change? So does the confrontation with the problem of climate change also make you more acting as entrepreneur against climate change? That were the central questions behind that. And of course we were looking at other theories that could be used in explaining that, in formulating hypotheses, and do we have data in really testing that? And there are theories that can lead us to formulate real hypotheses, and there are data for testing that. So the research question, what I just said, is the exposure to environmental risk increase awareness of climate change, and in this way the intention of starting up sustainable startups. So we are measuring not that they start startups, but the intention to do so. And for that, there is a theory of planned behavior, which actually has been applied quite often and explains how intention emerges. And intention emerges by 3 factors: by attitudes. And attitudes is something how you evaluate risks of doing something, and how are the opportunities of doing something. When you're in a dictatorship and nothing is allowed, the opportunities are very low and the risk is very high, so that does not lead you to the intention to do so. Contrary, maybe you live in a country where there are a lot of opportunities that are also caused by climate change, and you are actually able to take the risk doing so, that will increase your intention. That's what the theory would say. The theory also says if it is a subjective norm, it means other people start up enterprises as well. It's common to do so. Like in Germany, like in Europe, like in the United States, you also do so. So it increases your intention because everyone else does it, you do it too. And what is called perceived behavioral control, or also sometimes self-efficacy, that's, do you really think you can do that? Do you trust yourself? Do you have the self-confidence that you're able to do that? And all 3 factors lead to an increase of intention. And then you actually can come with a conceptual model by saying all those 3 factors increase intention, and that's mediated by the environmental risk you're in. So actually we expect that the effect of climate change on your living personally mediates this relationship of attitudes, subjective norm, behavioral control on intention. So we have captured a quite obvious question with a theory, and we have put it into hypotheses then in the next steps. So to every of the small steps we actually can formulate going back to prior research and can argue for a certain hypothesis we can test. And here's a hypothesis would be as a relationship between fear of failure, so your risk, and the intention to start up a sustainable business is affected by the degree of environmental risk exposure. And we have done that with all these facets. That's the opportunities, that's the perceived social norms, so do other startup enterprises, and that's the perceived behavioral control. Can I do that? Do I believe in myself? So, and then question emerged, where do we find data? About that, there is a global entrepreneurship monitor. There are many countries participating and getting every second year a survey done in all countries about certain questions concerning entrepreneurship. So you have this data pool that's open for all researchers we can use. And we can get out a lot of questions and a lot of variables we have into our own research. We can get it on a global scale. We have this data as global entrepreneurship monitor. And this risk exposure, we were going into the World Risk Index. And that also explains you which country run a higher risk of being affected by climate change and which country run a lower risk being affected by climate change. And you can put it actually into numbers, being high affected, being low affected, or being medium affected. Here are some countries. So United States would be medium, I think Germany would be low, and Netherlands, yeah, when you're living under the sea level, the risk is quite high, being affected by climate change. So, and then we have put it into regressions. In this way, logistic regressions. That means that we have run 3 regressions, exposure low. Logistic means binary data, exposure low or not, exposure medium or not, exposure high or not. And when you look at the independent variables, which explain the dependent variable, then you see, and the dependent variables intention, then you see that fear of failure, business opportunity, visibility, and self-efficacy all have significant effects, but does it change throughout when you go from low to high exposure? And it changes when you look at the row of fear of failure. It gets significant. In the beginning with low, there is no effect. We don't find any statistical effect in this sample we have. But we find it with high, and that's negative. So the risk you feel and you can express increases actually with environmental risk exposure. So the more you feel climate change, the more you are anxious and afraid of starting up a business. It does not work the other way around, it works in this way. And with these other variables you also see some effects. In summarizing that, there are 2 hypotheses accepted and 2 hypotheses rejected. That means something at the theory can be proven and can be accepted from us. Other things don't appear. So we actually add to the theory when we add the variable environmental risk exposure that it's not so easy to explain that under conditions of climate change and not so easy to use the theory of planned behavior, because in a full magnitude, this theory is not applicable under these conditions. Okay, another example out of our research. Also about sustainability, but about university startups. Also, we have startups at our universities. We have 20 to 30 startups every year in technology. And we have 3 incubators. We support the startups with whatever means to get started. But our aim is to have more and many more sustainable startups. But how do we really support sustainable startups with our measures? We can do a lot of things, but we actually don't know what we have to do best in what circumstances. And that's the question at this research. So the problematic thing in the beginning of this research is, okay, we can actually quite precisely say what we can offer to startups, academic startups at universities. We can provide network support services. We can link the startups with investors, with other startups. We can make matchmaking with other founders. We can provide infrastructure, construction sites, rooms, test equipments, laboratories. We have business support. You get business advice. You can go to a legal advice. So we can offer that all. But what effect does it have on a sustainability direction of startups? We don't know. So you could say, okay, actually there are a lot of research done that all has a positive effect on startups. So we could formulate a central hypothesis. That means all these things we offer have a positive effect on startups and sustainability. But that would be very shallow. So there is no real theory behind it. It's just based on prior research. So here you can actually make a decision. Do I do a real quantitative research, or do I do a quantitative research but do it more explorative? I'm not formulating hypotheses here because the hypotheses I could formulate are much too shallow to what I actually want to know. And in a detailed way, I'm not able to formulate hypotheses. So, and also it's quite easy to group the sustainable development goals into more social ones, more environmental ones, and more economical ones. And as you see, actually, sustainability is 60-70% social and not environmental. So at the core of sustainability is actually social change more than environmental change. But that's on a sideline. So we can actually also quite detailed capture what we do, what we offer to startups. And what we actually did, we have put it in a regression model, what we do and the direction of the startup itself as explorative research. So you see in a research design, you have to make many choices. You can quantify qualitative research, but you also can say it's a quantitative research, but I do it more as an inductive research because the hypotheses I could formulate and the theories behind it are much too shallow, too not really deep enough to formulate decent hypotheses. So that is also a regression model on nominal data. You should be able to read these tables. We will go so far in business research that you actually can do that and understand that. But to put it easy, what comes out, if someone goes only for money, the thing we can offer is matchmaking. That helps. That this teams actually find the right people who go in this direction. If you go for more environmental things, what the data shows that expert network and financial support is heavily needed. So that there are investments and that they are really linked to experts. And if you want to dive into social issues as startup, you need a whole breadth of support from business, from academic incubators. That actually turns out that there are real differences, and we can show that there are real differences in the data. Okay, so far about this lecture, and now we do the lecture again.